Now, is the Equality Act making British public life any fairer? Or is it really doing the opposite? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr Alka Seghal Cuthbert, who is the director of Don't Divide Us and a campaigner for classical liberalism and colourblind treatment before the law. Welcome to the Sceptic, Alka.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, good to have you here. So Don't Divide Us have brought out this excellent report on the Equality Act and, really all of the problems that it has bequeathed us. And I think, many might be aware of some of these, and we'll definitely get into those in a second. But before we do, I just want to hear a bit about the history of this. So, of course, Labour brought this in 2010. How did that fit with the legal architecture we had at the time? And what were they thinking in bringing it in?
Okay. Well, I wouldn't want to presume to get inside the head of Harriet Harman and the others who kind of crafted this act in the 2000s. But what is on public record when Harriet Harman introduced the bill in Parliament in, I think it was October 2010, was that it was an act that was meant to do several things, really. It had an economic dimension to it, where it was one of the aims was to reduce socio-economic inequality, which is something they're talking about bringing in as a protected characteristic now. So there is a desirability of reducing socio-economic inequality, to reform and harmonise existing equalities legislation. And that's often the main justification that has kind of lived on since its introduction, that it was just a mere technical bundling up of existing discrimination law, mainly sex, race and disability. However, there were other things that were kind of added into that, which I think have proven to be very problematic. So one of those was it also aimed to restate enactments relating to discrimination and harassment, but with a particular focus on the personal characteristics. Now you can see that's kind of shifting the spotlight away from the law addressing discrete acts of discrimination and onto kind of selected personal characteristics that was very much part of the multicultural politics of that time and subsequently identity politics. And then the final, another element that it introduced that has proved extremely problematic because of its impact on a kind of free culture and society, is that the Equality Act was orientated towards eliminating discrimination, which nobody would disagree with, or few would disagree with, and other prohibited conduct. And that other prohibited conduct is not specified. And you can see that's where the law is made very, very porous to cultural influences. So that other conduct today includes microaggressions, telling a dodgy joke, or being looked at in the wrong way, and that is what we see happening empirically in a lot of our cases. Not all of them, but a fair few.
Yeah, definitely. And just to put it into context a bit more here, then, when people talk about the equality state, they will generally sort of think of New Labour, and they might refer to it as being Blairite. But it's interesting then, actually, that this sort of central part of it actually came in right at the end of that era. And in fact, the effects of it have actually been unfolding over mostly those 14 years of the Tories.
Well, that's right. I mean, it was very, very weak opposition to it in Parliament when it was introduced. If you compare it, say, to the opposition the Conservatives mounted against the original Race Discrimination Act in 1965, which was a very robust, politically and philosophically robust discussion, the 2010 version was really rather pathetic. And within sort of 5 years of it being enacted, David Cameron was well on board with it, and in fact, extending it further himself. So you're quite right, a kind of cross-party consensus along the kind of multicultural state and its legal expression in the Equality Acts. In the Equality Act formed very quickly.
Okay, so let's get into some of your findings then. There's some really interesting ones in there. But I think there's this key one, isn't there, that there's been this massive increase in vexatious or more charitably just misconceived racism complaints in the workplace. And in fact, there's that amazing stat that only 1 in 20 of those is actually succeeding. So, I mean, something seems to be going very wrong here.
Yes, there is something definitely going wrong. I mean, when you think that overall, not if you take the whole employment tribunals hearings as a whole, which would be more than just race and more than just the Equalities Act, because it would also include, Employment Rights Act, health and safety regulations, etc. But, since 2017, there have been over 200,000 cases, which is quite a large figure, I would say. And then within that, our sample has taken 5,000 cases brought where race discrimination has been claimed, and only 5% have succeeded. Now, of the remaining 95%, you've got a mixture of cases. Some are very clear, vexatious, and race, case examples where race grifters have deliberately, weaponized aspects of the Equality Act to basically promote their own power positions within an institution. And we see that very clearly in one exemplary case in the National Health Service. It's a case of Ogue and Kalu in Bristol, I think. And it's quite extraordinary. I mean, even during the hearing, the judge was compelled to sort of openly say, look, we are not here to judge institutional racism throughout every aspect of British society. But actually, if you look at the Equality Act, you could claim, well, actually, that's what it is asking people and institutions to do now. But however, so you've got cases like that, but then you have you have a majority of cases where, really people's complaints that are arising out of ordinary, everyday workplace grievances, misunderstandings, and sometimes real kind of, genuine, legitimate complaint, about their conditions of work and their conditions of employment that have come about through changes in the workforce. But once upon a time, they would have been dealt with through union representation or, internal conciliation, which you still have to go through. But I think it's becoming largely perfunctory as people kind of want to get to the litigation point, as quickly as possible. So it's people misinterpreting, reinterpreting their experiences and their relationships through the prism of race, which is exactly what race theory wants. It says we should be doing, and this is the result, And so when people say, "Oh, we don't know about critical race theory. We've never read Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo," they don't need to have, because it's those beliefs are already within the Equality Act, and they're already being rolled out through EDI policies and human resources policies that have been there for quite a long time, predating the actual act itself.
Yeah, and you make a good point about people being sensitized to think in this way. And of course, we often hear about the judiciary being very woke. But actually, in some of these examples, you've actually had the judges saying, well, I can see that you feel that way, but that's not really quite right. And generally actually being quite sensible. I mean, there's one example that struck me was this comment about a funny jumper, which was presented as evidence in a racism claim, which was dismissed. But it's sort of, people have been really sensitized to this idea that there's racism everywhere, and they're making these complaints that have little to no grounds.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's really, and most of the time you're right to note that about the employment judiciary. In the main, they are very good at weeding out kind of unmeritorious cases and grievance cases. However, that said, there are clear examples, and more than just one or two, where you can see that the judges, when reporting, are clearly influenced by the wider cultural kind of zeitgeist. And you have a judge saying, well, whether rightly or wrongly, this claimant's feelings were authentic, and therefore that takes, that kind of shapes the judgment, the overall judgment. So a very good example of this is Sean Corby, who, like Maya Forstater, went to court to have his belief around Martin Luther King type colorblind racism, assigned as a protective belief, so it met the Granger test. The judge said, yes, this is a protected belief. However, when he then later on, subsequently, he went to test his belief in a court when there were people complaining about his postings on the intranet. These people, by the way, hadn't met him. They didn't even work in the same city. They worked in another city. And he was posting things that included Maya Angelou, and people like that. But nonetheless, kind of 4 activists in another city who were also part of ACAS complained. And in that case, the judge said, well, they really genuinely feel upset. And so, the judgment went the other way, so.
And just to be very clear, what precisely was it they were claiming to be upset by?
That he was objecting. I think at his workplace, they already had a BME network. And I think I don't know why exactly, but that they decided to introduce another network specifically for Black people. And Sean Colby, who is he's married to a non-white woman, said he felt this was discrimination, and this was really segregationist, which it is. I mean, it's exactly what it is. That was what. And so, and he sort of put his case that he openly admitted he did not subscribe to critical race theory. And that was it. That was literally it. So to have a different point of view is deemed offensive. And, you see that written explicitly even in schools, and some schools' anti-racist policies, where they will say it's not enough just to be not racist. You've got to be actively anti-racist. So we do see that in some cases now being, and if it's being part of the importance of this is that if cases and tribunals are taking this kind of thinking into account and coming to verdicts based on these beliefs, that then becomes incorporated into case law. And then it will be, referred to further down the line and become even more consolidated.
Yes, it's very concerning. And so that's the grievance and complaints aspect of it. But of course, there's this other aspect of it, which is the public sector equality duty, which is partly bringing together earlier duties, but also creating some new ones. And so, just tell us a bit about that. How does it work? And why do you think it's a problem?
Well, it's extraordinary, really. There are three legs, if you like, to the public sector equality duty, which is to advance equality, eliminate discrimination, and foster good relations between people in a workplace, that is, people with protected characteristics and without protected characteristics. And it all sounds very kind of hunky-dory, but it's absolutely meaningless. And it's a real overreach because, who doesn't have a protected characteristic? Everybody's got a sex. Everybody's got so it's not a case of, trying to come to a judgment between somebody who has a protected characteristic and somebody who doesn't. What happens is that it's a case of choosing which is the preferred group, and which is what we see, which is why we get this, legitimate perception of a two-tier justice, system happening. So there's that. And then there's the, advancing equality. Well, philosophically and politically, the only sources that can authorize equality are God in moral equality, or the kind of nation state in that you're a national citizen, and as a national citizen, you're equal. Since when have we needed the law to say that we're equal? This is a deeply worrying development, really. Just sort of casually accepting that, we're not equal unless the law tells us to, We don't know. And we see, that was kind of in the Supreme Court ruling recently. Do we need a court to tell us that there are two sexes? I mean, this is a very strange state of affairs, I think. And then eliminate discrimination. Well, that's just such a it's a super utopian goal. But we know what we mean when we say discrimination generally in the workplace. but it's quite limited, but that needs to be made explicit in the law. It's, acts that, you don't hire somebody or dismiss somebody or discipline somebody purely because of, more than you would another person, purely because they're black. That's what we mean. But to eliminate discrimination full stop to court is a meaningless demand, because we discriminate every day in who we choose our friends, what food we like, who we choose to go out with, etc. So it's a fundamentally incoherent part of the Equality Act that has come to dominate a lot of the kind of ethical conduct in our public institutions and private corporations as well. And it's caused a lot of confusion.
And would you characterise the aims of that part of it as social engineering?
Absolutely. Yes, it is. Because, equality and eliminating discrimination have traditionally been things that people have fought for in the social sphere through politics. And you incrementally make, sometimes it's done smoothly, sometimes it involves, conflict. That's what history's about. But it's been done in the political sphere, not in the courts, So this is a way of, it's not, when we talk about the law being politicized, it's not just that, different activist groups are using parts of it. This is actually making the law itself as a substitute for politics, really. So it's a very big, conceptual shift here.
And of course, there's this key legal distinction brought in under the public sector equality duty between positive action on the one hand and positive discrimination on the other. And supposedly the one is okay because it's just sort of helping so-called underrepresented groups, but the other one is wrong and illegal, and it is sort of terrible discrimination. But of course, in practice, the boundaries between the two can be quite blurred. And we've had, for example, the standout one probably is the treatment of those white male RAF pilots or applicants whose applications were rejected because essentially they were described as useless white males and because they didn't fit into the diversity quotas. And I mean, this was a clear example of positive discrimination. But I suppose my real question is this actually just a distinction without a difference?
Yeah, that's a very good way of describing it. Yes, it is. And I think it's very, we hear about these individual cases in the press that are kind of quite extreme. But that thinking has really kind of become part of everyday thinking now. It's become part of the common sense. There are some groups who are disadvantaged and you give them a leg up by offering them certain things. And offering them certain things means excluding others from accessing those things, whether it's a mentoring scheme, progression scheme at work, or this is happening, every day in all sorts of places. And by the advocates of it, it's seen as a morally, politically good thing. But to everybody else, we see it as segregation, which is. And actually, there's a case coming up that Dr. Anna Lutfi, who is a co-author of the report, is I think representing a woman who's taking her employer, she's in the NHS, purely to test. She's not doing it for her own self-interest. She wants to test this positive action against a very lesser-known clause in the Equality Act, Section 13(5), which prohibits segregation. So, what is the difference between positive action and segregation? I doubt many barristers would be able to define it properly. So how the rest of us are meant to deal with it, we don't know. But, let's see what happens as a case develops and what they say.
And of course, this kind of employment legislation is focused on the workplace. And as you've been saying, that's had a tremendous effect on the culture in terms of people thinking about all their interactions in this racialized way and being very sensitive to grievance all the time. But do you think this legislation is having an impact on the culture more broadly?
Yeah, well, yes. What I think is happening is that the culture and the law are kind of operating in a rather hideous feedback loop. It's sort of... The Equalities Act, unlike most other legislation, has a reach that is to change the culture. It affects everybody as soon as you walk out of your front door, because every employer, every provider of goods and services is duty bound by its stipulations, right? So it's all encompassing, and then with its public sector equality duty goals, you can see that its reach is also has no limits. So it kind of bleeds into the culture, and whatever is happening culturally is bleeding back into the law, as we're seeing in the comments of the judges in some cases. Not a majority, it's true, but unless that is stopped, there's a generational aspect here. As one generation of judges, either die or leave or retire, newer judges will come in who will be formed by this, the politics of identity, and their thinking will be like that, and they will see more and more cases of this. So it's a very serious problem, really. It's not just a few things you can kind of laugh at because they're so crazy or wacky. It's a very serious pivoting of our legal system and constitutional arrangements of British life.
And so on that question of why it hasn't been stopped, which you gestured to earlier, the Tories didn't do very much about it during their time in government. Although that said, what they did do actually right at the beginning was to disapply the socio-economic duty in the public sector equality duty, which in fact the Home Secretary Theresa May at the time described as one of the worst aspects of pointless political correctness and social engineering. So they were able to take this on in a limited sense right at the beginning, but they refused to follow through, and after that basically just allowed it to grow.
That's right. I mean, I don't. To me, what that speaks to is the fact that the kind of complete collapse of belief and confidence in the traditional norms and standards and processes that had shaped British life in the post-war period were really so weak as to be almost non-existent. And the consensus that formed around the Equality Act was not like a positive thing. It was a kind of a default one, a kind of desperate. This is a kind of way of managing. I mean, what it does is it allows the state to manage all our social relationships. So it's very antithetical to any traditional value of freedom that has been very much part of Britain's historical development, from freedom of conscience, freedom of an Englishman in his own home, in his private life, freedom to speak freely, especially in your home, which, in Scotland, I think they kind of think even that is a bit dodgy. So it's very authoritarian, but, with a kindly label of equality stuck on it.
And so inaction is one thing, but pushing it further is still worse. And that does very much seem to be what Labour is trying to do with its not just Equality Act, but Race Equality Act now. And just give me your thoughts on that, because it's quite disturbing, isn't it?
Deeply disturbing, and just shows you how utterly unhinged Labour are on this. There is a public consultation online that is open until I think the 30th of June, and I would urge people to take the time to have a look at it. It's not too onerous. Because the Race Equality Act, I mean, the shallowness of thinking behind it is kind of what really gets me. It's like they think, well, we introduce an act against sex discrimination, so let's do no one about race discrimination without any oversight. There's been no review, no scrutiny of what's actually been happening at all. We've had this law for 15 years now, and no one's really looked at what's been going on behind it. And Labour just come in and say they're going to introduce a Race Equality Act, thinking it's going to, and they're going to fold in disability into that as well in ways that are not quite clear as yet. I mean, there's very little that's clear because they haven't really actually sort of, like you would as a democratic government, say this is what we want to do, this is why, and put it to the people. It's all kind of drip, bit by bit information coming out. But, race is not the same as sex. We have sex is like almost a 50-50 split in the population, and they're spread out all over the country. So, people, ethnicity is not distributed in that way. And they want to make employers over a certain number. I can't remember exactly what the number is.
250, I think.
250 is to introduce mandatory reporting for their pay gaps along ethnicity, which is which is just stupid. I mean, it just does not make sense. And in fact, it's going to really backfire, because if you do that, then if you're just trying to imagine if you're an employer, and you're going to have to report pay gaps, in the next audit in 2 years' time or something, along ethnicity, then it's quite likely to discourage you to taking on, black employees at a lower level. So it will actually exclude entry for BME people, non-white people, at lower levels, because employers will understandably want to be covering their backs against any repercussions further down the line. So it's just there's been no thought put into it at all. You can just see they're just on autopilot, thinking they're on the right side of history. They think this is a moral thing. I mean, I don't really know what they think. Who can get inside the head of Keir Starmer at the minute? It's a terrible thing, and it will only exacerbate what is already a mess.
And of course, there's a comparison with the sex discrimination stuff that's going on. And of course, there are these massive lawsuits against companies like Asda, which basically say that because it pays its predominantly, but not entirely, male warehouse staff more than its predominantly female, but not entirely, shop floor staff, then that is evidence of some kind of discrimination. Now, this is actually quite a ridiculous argument, but nevertheless, this does seem to be what a lot of people believe. And now we're going to be applying the same logic to any disparity between ethnic groups that appears in a given firm. And I think this kind of thinking, which sees any disparity as necessarily evidence of some kind of discrimination, this is really behind a lot of this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what they're calling it's not just equal pay that was kind of the idea behind the sex discrimination thing. It's equal value of work, which is a very nebulous kind of concept, because you simply cannot have a free society and do that. That is like the ultimate uber micromanaging of the government into every kind of action in that an employer can do, because they say it themselves. Even I think I was reading some article where they were talking about Asda or Next. I can't remember. I think both of them are involved in cases. But it's just like, people would say, well, you wouldn't get me. I wouldn't want to do that job unless I got paid a lot more money, right? And we know we've got shortages in care work or in picking fruit, and it's just like, money isn't the whole answer by any means. There's a lot of practices that are quite egregious as well, but that is part of it, right? There are some jobs that just not many people will want to do because of the nature of the work. It's physically hard or dirty or difficult, etc. So it's a very anti-real utopian urge to, again, kind of social engineer the utopia as they see it, without in the meantime, by doing it by bypassing democratic politics and presenting it as a legal issue.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems Labour is absolutely committed to this, as committed as they were in 2010.
I know, they don't seem to have learned anything. They're just blindly, they don't. Their response to the report, the spokesperson said, "We're very proud of the Equality Act and the protections it affords the individual." Well, it doesn't. It affords protections to people as individuals if they present themselves as members of a disadvantaged, vulnerable group, which is a pretty demeaning way of presenting yourself anyway. You present yourself as a worker or as a member of a nation that has this legal system, which you are, calling upon to address this problem, and you expect that law to be applied, to be applicable universally without fear or favour. And this is the exact opposite. This is condoning the exact opposite. It's calling on the judiciary to weigh up things, not universally, but according to assessing value to different groups, according to social and cultural political priorities.
Well, I do think, happily, more people are paying attention to the legal tangle we have ourselves in. And so if you're thinking about talking to maybe the Conservatives or Reform or, whoever really forms the next government, what would you be recommending them to do about the Equality Act?
Well, I think there are probably two parts of it that could go pretty immediately without doing any damage, and doing good actually, which would be the public sector equality duty and positive action. And for the rest of it, we would say review and repeal, because you need to. We've only looked at race. We haven't looked at disability. We haven't looked at the other jurisdictions. There may be a case for positive action, even possibly with disability, but we don't know. But that's why we need a proper legal review of what protections are offered under the Equality Act. Probably suspect many of them will already exist in previous legislation. There's probably very little that's new. If there is something that is new and we want to keep it, well, then that's for us to decide, in the political and public discussion. But we shouldn't be afraid of repealing it. We shouldn't just go, oh my goodness, what will we replace it with? Because there's a very good chance that a lot of it already exists. It's not a case of replacing. It's a case of freeing up, freeing the solid traditional, things that have been tried and tested over centuries, aspects of British common law, case law, freeing that up away from this kind of stranglehold of equalities legislation.
And that's a very important point to end on, I think, because we've been talking about social engineering, essentially, and this is a very statist, top-down phenomenon of trying to get people to act in certain ways. But this is very antithetical to our bottom-up tradition of the common law and of sort of governing ourselves and not having to have anyone else interfere. And I mean, really, it's just against our national way of life, isn't it?
Absolutely, and sort of going, this is like a full circle in our discussion. The genesis of the Act was not a mere technical bundling up of what already existed. The Act was shaped during the 2000s. A lot of it was shaped by directives coming from Europe and from the EU and the EHRC. It isn't explicitly stipulated in the Equality Act, as far as I know, that you should respect diversity. And yet that has become a ubiquitous phrase and aim, of all kind of codes of conduct everywhere you look. But where you will find respect for diversity is in the European Anti-Racism Directive on Race of 2000. So, that states it explicitly, but obviously the protected characteristics within the Equality Act just follow that through substantively, that same thing. The idea is you respect diversity by having these protected groups. It's an utterly anti-universal, anti-liberal kind of philosophy that's underpinning the Equality Act.
Indeed, and I think that's very much why we need to get rid of it. Dr Alka Seghal Cuthbert, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Laurie.